Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Alan Butler and I've been asked to talk to you about the Infinite Crossroads as part of the current exhibition taking place in the Arts Institute. So very happy to do that, and I'd just like to give you a little bit of background on myself. I'm by trade and probably nature an oral historian, so I spend quite a lot of time working with different groups and communities, really asking them to tell their story and represent who they are. So very interested in this piece of work. I tend to work most strongly with an LGBT plus community, but as you'll see there's lots of overlaps in all sorts of work, so I'll just talk to you a little more about that. So I'm here because of the exhibition taking place by Kehinde Wiley, and Kehinde does some very interesting work, as I'm sure all of you will know, in terms of his portraiture, film work, all sorts of things, but the comment that I like the most is I paint the stories of people like me, and I'm really interested in that, as I say, because I think the stories of people like me are incredibly important, however you define me to be. So that's where we'll begin. Now, Wiley identifies as a gay man, but he has spoken about the fluidity of his sexuality. There's a little quotation there: "I'm a gay man who has occasionally drifted," which fits very nicely with this idea of the ship of fools that we'll be talking about shortly. So his work explores notions of race and gender and the politics of representation. And we'll come back to representation quite a lot through this, because we're looking at representing masculinity, we're looking at representing race, we're looking at representing sexuality, awful lot of representation that goes on with people. And in his work he refers to taking jabs at masculinity, and in particular the bravado that is attached to a masculine identity. And I'm very interested in how a masculine identity is considered and performed, so we'll keep referring back to that. So in 2017 he created his first film installation, A Ship of Fools, which references a 15th century book. It's based on a 13th century story which involved a number of people who were labelled as outsiders, who were made to set sail and forced into isolation. Now, that idea of outsiders I find incredibly interesting. People who are perhaps outsiders from the current culture, from current conversations, and in terms of sort of heritage work, artwork, people who are outside those dialogues, and I think that's incredibly important. Wiley in this film was really interested in people who don't conform to societal norms, which so am I, and he used some quotations from the philosopher Michel Foucault. Now, Foucault is, I think, incredibly interesting in terms of sort of queer narratives, all sorts of different narratives really, and the quotation that we've really seized upon here is this idea of confined on the ship from which there is no escape. The madman is delivered to the river with its 1,000 arms, the sea and its 1,000 roads, to that great uncertainty external to everything. He's a prisoner in the midst of what is the freest, the openest of routes, bound fast at the infinite crossroads. And I think we're kind of at that point in the world now, actually. So Foucault's work has been described as being historiographic, and what he does is he looks at different periods of time, different epochs of time, and considers them purely on their own merit. So he doesn't kind of go, oh, this particular period of time is better, or I'm going to compare the past to the present. He tries to judge them individually, and he sees all these competing visions as kind of structured and formalized around ideas of power. Now, one of the strongest sort of versions of power is the idea of hegemonic masculinity. So this idea that, you know, almost the best thing you can be is a straight white male. That's the norm, if you like, and anything different to that is seen as literally that different. So he tries to acknowledge this and consider all these periods of history in their own time and based on the values that are attached to them then. So he considers himself to be an he did consider himself to be an archaeologist of knowledge. And that different knowledge has been possible at different stages in human development. So he looks at men as being a concept and looks at man in terms of psychology, sociology and representation within literature and myth, which obviously brings us back to where we are with this exhibition. And also that there's a play around these representations. Now he sees language as the most fundamental way of communicating, and sees power, and this power of what's normal and what's hegemonic, as occurring through the transmission of power, and that happens through discourses. So different ways of talking about things, representing things, and by talking about things and representing things, we kind of make them true. It's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. If we talk about something as being the norm, then it becomes the norm. And each discourse is formed in its own kind of period of time, and it almost becomes unimportant if it's true or not true, because we just accept it to be true, and based on that it becomes our reality. So masculinity has been like defined, created and recreated through the discourses that surround them. As I say, he considers himself to be looking at the archaeology of knowledge, and in this way the transmission of power happens at different times in different places. What we have here is a representation from some of my work, which was when we were looking at adding some queer stories into Plymouth's archives. Basically, people found that they weren't represented there, and really early days, in an attempt to try and represent us, we coloured in, photoshopped some books and some boxes and made them pink, and thought maybe that would, as it says there, put some colour into the archive. Now obviously that wasn't what happened, but what did make a difference was actually including real lives and real stories in there, and finding a way that we could change the narrative. So create a new discourse within the archive, and by creating a new discourse in the archive, you actually kind of, implant people into history. You kind of give them that sense of reality, that self-fulfilling prophecy again. So we have an internalized sense of what masculinity is, but it's not really a stable entity. It's an act, as it were. It's a performance that people accept, recognize, and repeat. So by repeating that reenactment and re-experiencing masculinity, we gain a sense of what it actually is. You don't really spot masculinity until you see it done wrong. So if you see a man crying, maybe you think, oh, that's not the way you do masculinity. When it's done right, it's almost invisible, and I use the term right in a very loaded way, but in the way that we would accept it. We recognise masculinity as being something our culture has shown and defined us, even though it's not grounded in any original truth. This image here is a young man that I worked with as part of our Pride in the Past project, who, as well as being queer, as well as being gay, was also mixed race, and so felt pulled in quite a number of directions, and didn't feel that his truth was really represented in terms of the archive, media, just the thing. He found it very difficult. He found it very difficult here in Plymouth. So it just shows how narratives are very different, very individual, very subjective, and, can be problematic. So Foucault believed that the performances and the degree in which they were recognised gave them weight, and that made them meaningful through the transmission of power. By exchanging discourses, by ways of thinking, talking, representing a particular subject, they become truth. They become the truth of that subject. And he referred to that as a regime of truth. He suggested we must not imagine a world of discourse divided between one accepted discourse and an excluding discourse, or a dominant discourse and a dominated one, but a multiplicity of discursive elements that come into play various strategies. So wherever there's a discourse, there's actually hopefully an alternative discourse which challenges that, and that creates our infinite crossroads. And we need to acknowledge the complexities of who we are and what we want to be in the future, and make a safe space for conversations and discourses within our art galleries and museums, which is what I'm hoping you will gain from this exhibition.